Good afternoon, good evening, good morning. It's the Japan Zoomina from the University of California in San Diego. It's April 4th in the afternoon in San Diego, which makes it 6 a.m. In Jakarta, where our today's guest, John Bradford, is joining us from, and anywhere in between, I gather. I'm Ulrike Schaede, professor of Japanese business, UC San Diego, and director of the Japan Forum for Innovation and Technology, JFIT. Yes, this finds you at UC San Diego. We are at the School of Global Policy and Strategy, GPS. GPS is an international relations and public policy school. We offer a variety of degrees, and you can learn more about us at gps.ucsd.edu. And JFIT is our Japan Center, and you can learn everything you want to know about what we do at jfit.ucsd.edu. If you go to that page, you will find a little tab called Japan Zoominars. That's where you can find not only upcoming events, but also past events. Yes, our Zoominars are recorded. So if you go to jfit.ucsd.edu/Zoominar, that's where you find our gallery. For today, what this means is that we invite you to please type any questions you might have into the Q&A box. If I read out your question, I will refer to you only by your first name so that your privacy is protected. Our Zooming is a regular thing. So today, of course, we have John Bradford. Following John in 2 weeks from now is Lowell Shepard, who is a special character. He's sailing around Japan, and actually the History Channel is following him, and he'll join us to talk about what he finds along Japan's distant coastlines. And he's actually going to join us from Okinawa, where he's filming for the History Channel. And then in early May, we go back to business, and we'll have Sam Gordon from Deloitte Tohmatsu to talk about Tokyo as an international financial center. Stay tuned. There's more where this came from, and so we're happy to have you here. Okay, let me stop the share and introduce our guest today. Is John Bradford. Hi, John. Good morning in Jakarta.
Good morning. How are you? Good to see you from across the Pacific Ocean.
We're almost stretching the boundaries of the day line, I guess. So John Bradford is senior fellow at RSIS, which is the Rajaratnam School of International Studies at Nanyang Technological University in Singapore. He joined RSIS in 2020. Before that, he was at ICAPS, which is the Yokosuka Council of Asia Pacific Studies. He spent almost a decade there. John has a BA from Cornell and a master in Asian Studies and a master in Strategic Studies from the aforementioned Nanyang Technological University. For many, many years, John was in the U.S. Navy, and his positions there included Deputy Director of the 7th Fleet Maritime Headquarters, Country Director for Japan, where he served in the Office of the Secretary of Defense Policy, and he was a commanding officer at one of those ballistic missile defense capable Aegis destroyers. So he has been on the ships, he has monitored the ships, he's guided the ships, and he's retired U.S. Navy commander. Thank you, John, for your service. We need it. So John's research since he retired has been on the Indo-Pacific maritime issues and security cooperation, and he is known as one of the most informed people on the Japanese military, in particular the Kaijo Jietai, the Navy, because that was his bailiwick before. So John, thank you for joining us today. It's really great to have you.
Yep, thanks. Looks like my sound is good, so thank you very much for having me.
So why don't you start us out with a few thoughts of Japan's military interests and activities in the South China Sea, and then we'll take it from here. As you know, it's a conversation. People will start typing in Q&A, but let's hear from you first. Give us a little bit of a rundown of what your thoughts are about the matter.
Yeah, thanks. I think it's important to just start by observing that not all Japanese people seem to recognize it. It's probably something that may come up in your conversations at the next Zoominar, but Japan is an intensely maritime nation. I think it is commonly known that it completely relies on the seas for trade, but other areas of its sector and of its economic sectors and its social sectors are tied completely to the ocean. The JMSTF may be a self-defense force, but by pretty much any count, you have to say it's the world's third most important military. In terms of shipbuilding in the 1960s, Japan was clearly the global leader. It's been challenged by Korea and China since then, but those three still ranked in the top three. And whether Japan is in second or third depends on what you're counting. And it depends on what kind of ships are being ordered each year, because they specialized in the most advanced and most expensive types of ships, whereas China puts out greater volume of lower tech ships. So what does that all mean for the South China Sea? If you look out from Japan, it's immediately surrounded by the Philippine Sea and the East China Sea. But all of the trade and all of the relationships that go to the south and to the west, so to South Asia, to the Middle East, to Africa, to Europe, all go via the South China Sea. So therefore, obviously, as step one, Japan understands that the security and the stability of sea lanes is absolutely essential to its economic well-being and therefore to its national security. It also looks at the South China Sea conflicts and reviews Chinese activities, and it sees that it sees that China's using tactics and techniques which are very similar to those which are being used in the Sino-Japanese conflict in the East China Sea. And so because of those similarities, Japan watches very, very keenly. It's also interested, very importantly, in being a strong partner to its friends in the ASEAN countries. So it's willing to assist and work with them to preserve their interests. And then, of course, the United States has its own reasons to be involved in the South China Sea disputes or be interested in the South China Sea disputes. So Japan, as a good ally, seeks to respond to U.S. demands or seeks to augment what the U.S. is trying to do. So in recent years, Japan's becoming more and more involved, not so much directly in the disputes, well, actually directly in the disputes on the diplomatic front, but in general has a long history of trying to help stabilize that region and help make sure that its maritime infrastructure is strong and that those sea lanes are safe from all kinds of threats. Those would include natural disasters, those would include navigational safety threats. They would include things like pirates and terrorists and other criminals. And then, off and on in history, and right now is one of those periods in history where state conflict is something that threatens the security of those sea lanes. So I thought I'd just kind of walk through some of the history because, I think one of the big questions is what does Japan do and what does it not do? And I think if you look at the history directly, you can see how it's evolved over time and how it's doing more and more things. It's doing things with more elements of state power, with more agencies and activities that the Japanese government controls. And it's doing it in more different maritime domains. So, obviously, pre-World War II is a very different world than today. But in the imperial and Meiji eras, Japan maintained economic interests directly in the South China Sea. It had facilities on those disputed rocks and islands that are discussed these days to support its own fishing activities and guano harvesting. It even had small, almost colony type groups of people in the early colonial era, in the 16th and 17th century. It had colonies of Japanese communities in the Philippines and other islands around the South China Sea. But World War II sort of sort of reset all of that and removed Japanese influence from the region for a few years. And then they really came back specifically in the maritime area in the 1960s. And with Japanese economic growth and Japanese interest in preserving those sea lanes, it started getting involved in the late 1960s in infrastructure buildup and safety of navigation. So it began doing training in the region. It began funding the installation of navigation aids. It began providing dredging services for shallow parts of the Strait of Singapore and Malacca, et cetera. And that was generally well received in the region. And then, there was some sort of association with these being some sort of soft reparations, or if not reparations, at least a way to rebuild the Japanese image in the region. The next sort of inflection point I'd mentioned was 1975. The Japanese oil tanker Showa Maru was involved in a collision in the Strait of Malacca, and that left a massive oil spill in the area. And Japan jumped into trying to help with the cleanup, but then it also became a leading supporter of oil spill cleanup technology and activities, and capacity is probably the best way to phrase it, in Southeast Asia. Something that you can see, a thread that you can see pulled through today, or just in the last few weeks, something that's really escaped the international media, but inside the Philippines, there was a big oil spill, and Japan deployed forces to assist with that. And that's sort of, even here in Indonesia, where I spent most of my time, in Singapore, it's not in the daily newspaper, but it was front page news in the Philippines. So now, if you take a look, this is all civilian led. Even the Japan Coast Guard, much less the JMSDF, are really not involved. The Japan Coast Guard is doing some of the work, but only very much at the behest of JICA or the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. So, I think most of your listeners, at least the Japan specialists, will be familiar with the 1977 Fukuda Doctrine, where Prime Minister Fukuda said that he was going to return Japanese engagement to Southeast Asia at a government level and expand that dramatically. But one of the caveats he stated was that the military forces, or that the SDF, would not be involved, and that those would remain something where that would remain an area where Japan is not engaged. And I'll tell you that over the preceding, what is that, 45 years, 55 years, 1977 to today, that military element of the Fukuda Doctrine has been slowly eroded, and today the SDF is an important partner to Southeast Asian states. But that was very slow. Sort of, if you just sort of again watch a history, 4 years after the Fukuda Doctrine, the United States government is working with Japan to increase the roles, missions, and capabilities that the Japanese take up in a military situation. And Prime Minister Suzuki announces that Japan is going to take a more active role in defending sea lanes and send its SDF forces further out abroad to do that. But the distance that those forces are listed as, a name to do, is 1,000 nautical miles. It says Japan will take responsibility for the safety of sea lanes 1,000 nautical miles from Japan. Now, why 1,000 nautical miles? What exactly does that mean? It wasn't entirely clear, but it's pretty clear that that so happens to be about the distance to Guam from Japan. But it's also pretty much the distance from Tokyo to the Bashi Channel, which would be Japan's main entry point into the South China Sea and Southeast Asia. So even in this point, Japan is stepping up on behalf of the alliance to provide more sea lane support, but it's saying, okay, but we're not going to get into the South China Sea. In the 1980s, that pretty much stayed the case, but in the 1990s, after Prime Minister Nakayama increased multilateral engagement, you started seeing Japan getting a little bit more involved in things when it's part of a multilateral exercise, or when it's being invited in by ASEAN or an ASEAN-related body. So in 1999, the Japanese government decided that it wanted to sort of take the barriers away that prevented the Japan Coast Guard from doing capacity building in the region. And then suddenly, very, very quickly, within a couple of years, the Japan Coast Guard becomes the main maritime security capacity building player in Southeast Asia. It's doing anti-piracy exercises throughout the region. It's establishes liaison officers and attachés throughout the region. And so in the 2000s, really, it's a Japan Coast Guard heyday where they're really, really doing a lot to build regional capacity and develop cooperation. In that same period, you start seeing the SDF, especially the Kaijo Jeitai, the JMSDF, the Maritime Self-Defense Force, sliding in very slowly and very carefully through multilateral exercises. I think 2005 is probably an important year. This is when the Western Pacific Naval Symposium, which is a sort of club of chiefs of Navy throughout the Western Pacific, from the United States to India, holds a multilateral exercise in Singapore, and the JMSDF send a ship. And in the same year, although it's not the JMSDF, it's the Ground Self-Defense Force, Japan enters Cobra Gold, which is a U.S.-Thai international exercise. Now, it's important that while Cobra Gold had previously been an exercise of national defense of Thailand, and Japan had not been involved. In 2005, because of the 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami, it turned into a civil military fusion exercise, and with a much larger focus on things like development and humanitarian assistance to disaster response. So that was part of the reason why Japan felt more comfortable. And we could talk a little bit later about the motivations and the barriers of behind these decisions. But I'll say simply, and probably oversimplified, Japan felt a bit more comfortable arriving in for Cobra Gold in that year. So that's 2005, and I think that around 2010 is the next biggest inflection point for the topic of today's the core topic of today's Zoominar, which is the SDF's role in the South China Sea or in Southeast Asia. I would note that 2010 about corresponds to what our friend Andrew Oros has termed Japan's security renaissance, and you definitely can see a renaissance in terms of the SDF or the Japanese de facto military's involvement in Southeast Asia. So in 2010, I think they might be curious to some of the listeners that that's during Prime Minister Hatoyama's term. He sends the SDF to Southeast Asia on their own on capacity building missions, and this is the first time that the JMSDF has gone to Southeast Asia to do bilateral activities and to build up capacity. Now, before that, they passed through the region on the way to the Gulf of Aden for piracy, and maybe they stopped and they did a small goodwill exercise. The training cruise, the annual training cruise, the JMSDF did, had passed through and done the same thing. And as I mentioned, they joined these big multilateral events, especially those related to maritime security and maritime security and humanitarian assistance. But at this point, if you remember, Hatoyama announces that he will be sending the UI boat, the ship of brotherly friendship is one way to translate it, I guess. And this vessel goes to Vietnam and Cambodia in alignment with the U.S. Pacific Partnership Program and does capacity building for Vietnam and Cambodia. So quickly after that, you see that Japan organizes inside the Ministry of Defense its capacity building office, and it begins its own train of SDF-oriented capacity building activities throughout Southeast Asia, particularly the maritime states. And this is something that they had not done ever in the past, right? They'd only done as part of the Japanese imperial entry into Southeast Asia in the late 19th century, early 20th century. Obviously, the character of that was very, very different. So that's what it's doing in sort of the partnership side, but this is also when you start seeing the SDF showing up in Southeast Asia, in the South China Sea on its own, performing missions somewhat similar to what the United States would call presence missions, just being there, learning about the region, sometimes displaying and letting the international public or your potential adversaries know you're there, and sometimes staying quiet. In 2011, we had there was a JMSDF, U.S. Navy, Royal Australian Navy exercise in the South China Sea. And that's the first clear acknowledgement I can see of Japanese vessels being in the South China Sea for the purpose of being in the South China Sea, as opposed to transiting the South China Sea. Now that said, it probably wasn't the first time. So it was 2011 was that exercise. In 2018, Prime Minister Abe was asked questions about Japanese submarines in the region, and it was kind of being pushed to as a gotcha moment. You're militarizing, and he said that Japanese submarines have been routinely in the South China Sea since 2002. Well, actually, he said for the last 15 years. Now, I don't want to replay that. Does Abe know exactly what year the ships are off the top of his cuff? And even if he did, he's a politician, so the truth is shaded. I'm not saying that he would be distruthful, but he may choose how to present information in order to score his political points, because that's the nature of politicians in a democracy. But in any case, what you can see is that from the 2000s, but really much more much more publicly from 2010 onwards, the SDF has been a regular participant in events in Southeast Asia. They're in South China Sea to be in the South China Sea, and especially you can see the surface ships and the submarines. I think the submarines one of the motivations that retired Japanese flag officers, admirals often talk about is that they want their submarines there because China may be using the South China Sea as a so-called submarine bastion, where it puts its missile submarines in that area and tries to keep everybody outside of that area so that they can safely be available for conducting strikes during a conflict. That's obviously retired admirals make some sense. I can understand the logic there. And the surface ships are providing more traditional presence. And then we're increasingly seeing JMSTF P3s flying, usually often, but not well, out of the Philippines and Vietnam. These are always bilateral events, which are hosted by the local partner. In Vietnam, in the Philippines, they're often in coordination with the United States or United States exercise. But in Vietnam, it's the other way around. In Vietnam, in many cases, the JMSDF relationship with the Vietnamese Navy has been a door opener for the United States. So, for example, before the first United States aircraft carrier was able to visit a port in Vietnam, the year before that, Vietnam hosted Izumo, the large destroyer helicopter carrier being converted into an aircraft carrier. Vietnam was able to, that was useful for Vietnam for two reasons. From a logistical standpoint, it got them to allow to practice hosting a large ship full of foreigners to their military and providing the logistical support for that. But also it allowed them to sort of blunt some sort of criticisms that they might face of getting too close to the United States. They did something with Japan first, and then they can say, well, it's just sort of business as usual. Now the Japanese are here. So I think that kind of brings us up to the current day. I would argue that in many ways, Japan is, very, very much a leader. In fact, I have an article in Asia Policy about Japanese leadership in the maritime sphere in the Western Pacific. They're opening doors to the United States, and they're acting in their own national interest and getting involved in the region. I think that's probably kind of where I wanted to take us if we wanted to go to the Q&A.
Yeah, thank you. This is great. So can I just ask a few sort of basic questions? You mentioned
Sure.
the word capacity building a lot, and I was trying to figure out what exactly that means. Is it joint training? Is it providing?
Yeah, it could be any of those things. So
tools
the Japanese, a few years back in the Japanese Ministry of Defense white paper, they defined capacity building as using Japan's capacity to help other states develop their capacity. So the point is that Japan wants other states is helping them get better at providing maritime security or other defense activities. Now, what that actually is, can be a bit nuanced. I think most of the time, if you're reading Japanese government sources and they talk about capacity building, and that they often translate that directly into sending Japanese trainers to those countries to provide like classroom style instruction, or bringing their technical leaders or national leaders to Japan for training. So that's definitely one sort of capacity building. When I talk about capacity building, I go a bit broader. I think it's not just teaching skills in a classroom, but it can also be things like an exercise, because in an exercise, both of you are coming together to try to get smarter on something or get better at things. So that's using Japanese strength to build capacity. And then it's also tech transfer and the provision of goods. And in the past, say the last 20 years, that has primarily been the provision of unarmed patrol boats. Those were first provided, whether you want to argue this is government or not, that's a whole separate conversation, but they were first provided by the Nippon Foundation, providing Japanese-built Coast Guard vessels to Southeast Asian countries. And then they started being provided those same vessels via ODA or ODA-related schemes. Now, all of those things were unarmed, and they were essentially defensive issues. But it kind of grew in 2018, 2017 or 18, I can't remember which, when we had the first transfer from the Japanese Self-Defense Force to another military ever. And so the Japan Maritime Self-Defense Force retired some training aircraft, and those were given to the Philippines so that the Philippines could repurpose them as maritime patrol aircraft. Now, these are just small airplanes, 2 engines, guys with binoculars. They're not really hardcore military equipment. I mean, notice Japan was using them for training only and retired them. So really, the idea of it being a military grade maritime patrol aircraft, it isn't, it's just an airplane. But it still was very, very important because it was the first time ever in the history of the SDF that SDF gear was given to another country. So huge groundbreaking event and sort of the normalization, if you want to use that phrase, of Japanese security external policy. And then, more recently, Japan agreed to provide the Philippines with air defense radars. That was in 2020. And these are air defense radars, which you would use to look at and identify incoming missiles and incoming enemy planes. So this is significant because it's just another step towards normalization, because these are, unlike those airplanes, which are just airplanes, and they're not, like, well, that's useful. They're not in a modern warfare sense, they don't help that much. They let you know, oh, there was something over there. I had to get close to it. I had to see with binoculars. You can't really use it to target a modern, what we call a kill chain, where you detect something, you identify it, you target it, and then you fire on it. But these air defense missiles do. These air defense radars, excuse me, do. And they're being acquired by the Philippines at the same time. The Philippines is buying BrahMos missiles, which are high-end anti-ship missiles from India, et cetera. So Philippines is going to use this to complete a kill chain, which is something that in sort of the rules regarding capacity building in Japan, the idea that we're providing the capacity for another country to fight a military conflict versus a third country was off limits, and now is not. And then I think, the final step in that story would be just very recently in the last few months, last year actually, Japan developed a new fund, which is separate from its overseas development assistance ODA fund and separate from the SDF, which is specifically provide defense capability development, defense capacity building, as opposed to things like maritime security or dive medicine, or these things which are useful to a military but are not part of the sort of core mission of being ready to fight another military. It created that new fund. So we're going to see more of these sort of transfers coming up in the near future.
So this is fascinating. I'm reminded of the introduction of Professor Richard Samuel's book on Japanese security. And in the intro, he writes how he taught a class at some point and referred to the maritime self-defense forces as the Navy, and the students were, no, you can't do that. We're not a Navy, right? And then it was after 2010, he taught that exact same class, and he goes through the whole spiel about the Japanese maritime self-defense forces, and the student raises his hand and says, well, we'll call it Navy now. And so he observed even a change in the self-identification of self-defense force members as just saying, let's call it Navy. It's shorter, it's easier, and that's what it is. Is that something that has come across your radar as well?
Yeah, I mean, I do remember reading that, and obviously it's a pretty small sample size. So I thought I thought Dick overstated, I had this thing and then I had this other thing, and I had 2 students and they called themselves differently 4 years apart. But I'm sure it actually happened. And it's not a bad example because there is a tendency and a trend. While the Japanese language has not shifted very much, right, of what things are referred to, but in English, in English, the JMSDF is always called a destroyer in English. But I think as individuals, they've become much more comfortable skipping to international language and saying,
yeah. And I think that's actually it's a reflection of domestic change, right? That that's actually the question behind this, right? Is there's clearly a bigger willingness within Japan to have the Japanese military just be a military.
Yeah, I think that's as another shorthand, I think that's probably pretty accurate. I think what you've seen is two trends. I mean, I've been watching this particular dynamic closely for about 20 years. And on one trend, you see individuals that are driving for a more conventional military posture, a more conventional defense posture. Often the people that are very concerned about Japan's prestige or Japan's history. But actually, I think that those people are overplayed in terms of the difference they're making. I think the more powerful organizations are the increasingly concerned about what the Japanese always refer to as their severe security situation. And so you have forces like the Ministry of Defense, increasingly the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, but others too, pushing and pulling and leading in that direction. Whereas on the other hand, in the past, the organizations, officials, groups of people that would have opposed to that are falling away, right? I mean, and on the political level, it's the easiest way to track this, right? The Communist Party collapsed, the Socialist Party took opposition to the existence of the JMSDF out of their platform, et cetera, et cetera. And so those organizations, may still be resisting this change or arguing against it inside that sort of policy discussion that's happening inside Tokyo, but they're not asserting as strongly as they once were. And then I think, increasingly, other agencies, whatever it might be, are changing. So I guess I would give I think one of the biggest changes, the one that I see that's even more so than in the SDF, whereas I don't feel that people's characters have changed, but their comfort has. That's how I would phrase that term, that language issue. But like in JICA, 20 years ago, the JICA was, were very, anti-military. You mentioned the SDF and they shut up. And now I see, living here in Southeast Asia, I often see the JICA representatives as the convening factors that are bringing together not just the self-defense forces, but international militaries and the U.S. military. And to me, the idea that 20 years ago, a JICA person would say, yeah, we need to solve this problem. Who are my resources? Oh, I need to get PACOM to come over. I just can't even imagine that. And I don't think that culture's entirely shifted. You go to the JICA headquarters and there's a lot of former Japan Coast Guard people. There's a lot of people that have been involved with other agencies, which are, also on board with sort of Japan acting as a more normal defense state. But, there's also people which cling to an idealism of an earlier age in Japan. So I definitely think there's changes afoot, and it's changing the center of the argument of what should Japan be, right? And it's that center of the debate is moving.
So there's one more question on these domestic things, and then there's a ton of questions going, into the region. But the domestic question is actually is from Kim, and I have a very similar one, which is about the Coast Guard. You mentioned the Coast Guard was initially the agent to do the capacity building. I had a student here from the self-defense forces who was then, upon return to Japan, seconded to the Coast Guard. And so I was surprised by that. And so my question to you was using the Coast Guard for the capacity building a sort of a workaround on some of these hesitations that we just talked about that is no longer necessary, or was the Coast Guard always sort of a subsidiary of the SDF, or how does that work?
Yeah, so the Japan Coast Guard is not a subsidiary to the SDF. They're completely separate. In fact, if you're an American model, the U.S. Coast Guard refers to itself as is referred to as it's not part of Department of Defense, but it's a uniformed service or even an armed service. The Japan Coast Guard is very strongly a civilian Coast Guard, and their people are not officers. They're civilians, more like a policeman. In fact, a story I have there is, I was a student at the National Institute of Defense Studies, which is a Ministry of Defense organized war college type thing. And in addition to the majority of the students, 90% were SDF officers. And then there was 10% of us, which were folks from overseas or from other agencies. And Ami-san was the Coast Guard officer. Oh, I probably shouldn't have said his name, but oh well, Ami, you're stuck now. I'm going to tell a story about you. And we were usually in civilian clothes, and every once in a while, we would have to wear uniforms, maybe like once a month. Usually when there was a senior officer coming to visit or something. And I said, Ami, we're going to this military base. Why don't you ever wear a uniform? John, I'm a civilian. But you're in the Coast Guard, and I've been on your ships. You have uniforms. I'm a civilian. But you do have a uniform. I'm a civilian. And so, at the end of the conversation. And so to kind of, that's the story. To get into some of the history you're talking about, I do think that, so in 2000, when the Coast Guard was deployed, I do think that there was an element of some individuals in the Japanese government perhaps seeking to normalize Japan's security posture, and knowing that the Japan Coast Guard was what they could use when they couldn't use the SDF. There's some people that talk about a competition between the Japan Coast Guard and the SDF, and how the Coast Guard leaned into this mission and jumped into this mission in order to get personnel prestige and funding from the government ahead of the SDF. And I think there's probably some. I've actually, my first academic article was on this particular topic, and I think there's some merit to those arguments. I certainly don't discount them, but I think more fundamentally, the Coast Guard was just the best option for the mission, right? The Japan Coast Guard is very, very good. I said that the Japan Maritime Self-Defense Force, in John Bradford's accounting, is the third best Navy in the world. The Japan Coast Guard is the second best. It's important, it's good, it's capable. It's a safety agency mostly. It's a law enforcement agency as well. It's not a defense agency. And so if you want to get involved in Southeast Asia and you want to develop capacity for maritime law enforcement, maritime safety, they're the best people to do it. They know how to do it more than the SDF. Plus, they might be more welcome in the region. They're not going to aggravate security dilemmas. So there's all good reasons why the Japan Coast Guard was there first, beyond the idea that they were a pathfinder or a normalizer. Now, in recent years, I would just kind of keep talking about the Japan Coast Guard. There's been two real developments. I think since 2010 that was mentioned. They've become the forefront force to respond to Chinese Coast Guard activities and naval activities in and around the Senkakus. So they've gotten a huge plus up in budget and prestige and mission. And now they do have this huge, it is a safety mission. It is a law enforcement mission, but clearly it has direct national security repercussions, which is their mission around the Senkakus. And now the Coast Guard is taking part in, and this is part of those sort of identity shifts that we were talking about earlier. I've been told that when the National Security Council first stood up, the Coast Guard was invited to send a representative, and the Coast Guard said, no, thank you. We're a safety agency. Why would we go to the National Security Council? And that's very different now. And that they're now a leading voice in national security conversations. So that's a very quick change of 5 or 6 years ago. And the last caveat I would say is, 10 years ago, I was a U.S. Navy active duty officer, and I wanted to bring the Coast Guard into conversations of U.S. national security or of alliance. I had to be very careful, and we had to use surrogates. As a U.S. Navy officer, the JMSDF would say to me, well, I can talk to the Japan Coast Guard, but they're more likely to listen if you get the U.S. Coast Guard to talk to them. And that's evaporated. There's now commonality. As you say, your student goes back on a secondment. I'm sure it's a liaison officer to help them, but now they have a permanent staff of people that are carrying information between the Kasuma, Gaseki, and Ichigaya and taking part in those conversations. Sorry for the long answer. This is
fascinating. It was just privatizing security and defense. That's a super interesting topic. So you mentioned the Senkaku Islands, and indeed we have questions about that. My dear colleague TJ is wondering whether you could talk a little bit about the Senkaku Islands, and then we have a whole cluster of questions about Taiwan. So let's maybe, I don't know whether you want to connect them or something. So TJ's question is, can you speak to the Senkaku Islands as well as Myanmar joint exercises with India, US, and Australia? how do these link to the South China Sea activities? And
yeah.
So let's have that. Let's do that first.
Yeah, the strongest link is, the Japanese watched the Chinese strategies of sending in lots of maritime militia, lots of fishermen, which are under the influence of the government, and then the Coast Guard, and populating a maritime area, and therefore using that sort of population to sort of wrest the normalization of control over the space. And then they can use that to gain, to set the new normal of who is in administrative control of the space, what's the normal in terms of law enforcement, et cetera. And I think from a Japanese perspective, they've watched China use a tactic around the Senkakus, find it useful and effective, and then use it in the South China Sea, or vice versa, use one in the South China Sea, and then vice versa, use one in the East China Sea and the Senkaku Islands. There's a lot of concern that the tactics that China used to seize control over Scarborough Shoal could be exactly replicated in the Senkakus. And the tactics are actually pretty effective on the Chinese side. So you really think through, like, how do I walk that space between losing control of the islands and not escalating to a major conflict? And so I know a lot of thinking has been put into that. So I think that's a big limit, a big area of concern is that that the Chinese expansionists at the very national level, the expansionist tendencies are the same, but at the sort of on the ground level, the tactics and techniques are similar, and so that's a strong linkage. But I don't want to overplay that, because I have to make a important point. Like, I mean, that's definitely 100% true now, but a lot of the academic literature says Japan's involved in the South China Sea, because of this, or because of the linkages with the East China Sea. And I'd say that's not true. The conflicts in the East China Sea were on the back burner, even arguably on the mend, in the period between 2000 and 2009, right? We have the joint the joint exploitation regime in the East China Sea, et cetera. And this is the period where Japan was getting first more involved in the South China Sea. So while there's definitely a connection, you can't say Japan is interested in the South China Sea because of the Senkakus. It's interested in the South China Sea for all the reasons I mentioned at the beginning, because the South China Sea is important. And then I think I can talk to the exercises, much more briefly. Japan is keen on developing multilateral and multinational structures that preserve good order at sea and preserve the norms of the rules-based order. It's been the leader in that. I will say that, and I actually have an article on this on Japanese. I mentioned it earlier on Japan's maritime leadership in East Asia. It has actually, in many ways, been more proactive than the United States as a builder of teams, a builder of organizations. And these exercises are part of that. You can look specifically to the action that Prime Minister Abe took to build the Quad, something that was then adopted by the United States, and then I'd say India and Australia followed along, and that's where that's directly linked to those exercises. Although I have to caveat, especially in India, it will be very clear that the Malabar Quadrilateral exercise is not the same as the Quad, and that they're independent of each other. But they definitely support each other, and they're definitely coming from a common alignment of interests.
So you mentioned that the Senkaku really is not the reason that Japan is so interested. I guess we're now looking at
well, Taiwan. I guess let's phrase it this way: the Senkakus are an important reason why Japan is interested in the South China Sea. But were there not a Senkaku issue, Japan would still be interested in the South China Sea.
So, Rob, there are a number of Roberts that have a question. Robert number one just wants a quick footnote. Do you have any idea what percentage of Japan's inbound and outbound trade is via shipping versus air cargo?
Yeah, it's like 99% by sea.
Excellent.
And I don't know the percentage, but if you think about it, its trade with North America and South America mostly goes via the Pacific. Its trade with the entire rest of the world goes via the South China Sea.
Yeah. So what I've heard though is that the stuff that's really expensive and often perishable goes by air. So like tuna and semiconductors and that sort of thing. But yeah. So I mean, and Japan runs the shipping lines, right? And like Evergreen and that sort of thing. So Japan builds the ships. Japan runs the shipping lines. There's a huge commercial interest.
If I just kind of edit that. In the 1960s, Japan was the world's biggest ship maker and the biggest ship operator. Like the United States, it's divested a lot of the ownership of the ships. So if you look at the amount of ships that Japan owns, it's still a world leader, but it's no longer number one. But if you look at how many it manages, its shipping lines, which then contract these ships out, it is number two to China.
Yes. And so that's a huge commercial interest. So Robert, number two, would like to know, what role would Japan play in defending Taiwan from attack? And there's another Japan-related question, so let me just read that out as well. Will you please discuss the difficulties of resupplying Taiwan from a naval point of view? So if there were a problem, from a naval point of view, what are the difficulties, I guess is the question.
So as far as Japan's role in defending Taiwan, I'll make, well, see, how should I answer this? So my first point would be, we don't know for sure, right? This is like asking, what is the United States going to do in the case of, if X country gets attacked? We don't know. We can look at things like national statements. We can look at things like publicly stated strategies. We can look at things like national interests. But wars are complicated things, and how they start matters. Who's in charge at the time matters. How effective public messaging is matters. So I don't think we can say what Japan will do. Now I'll say that if Japan does not allow the United States access to the bases in Japan, which it should under the treaty, but the treaty can be, the treaty is only one's word. You can change your mind anytime. I'm going to say there's legal escape clauses, but there's also an opportunity to say, no, I don't want to do that anymore. The United States, if Japan does not offer use of those bases, then there's not really a military option to stop a conventional invasion of Taiwan. Now, John Bradford would assess that I think Japan would allow that, would allow use of those bases. And so if those bases, so the question is, once they allow the use of those bases, where does it escalate from there? If American fighters are flying out of Okinawa or Kyushu and they're contesting the airspace above Taiwan, then obviously China's temptation is going to be to strike those air bases with its couple thousand missiles it has, which are specifically designed for attacking those air bases. And so, if it does that, now Japan is being drugged into the war, and that could be a reason for Japan to retreat. John Bradford's opinion is that they'll probably recognize the second and third order effects of that and see that a retreat is not a good option, and increase their involvement, and perhaps provide escort duties, or even maybe fly some of those air missions themselves. But again, we don't know that. One thing I can say is it was in the news. There was I would participated in a tabletop exercise hosted by the Sasakawa Peace Foundation. Sort of war gaming, I should use that word, this scenario, and seeing how the United States and Japan would react. And the Japanese role players, who were, senior think tankers with close ties to the government, and recently retired officers, they quickly brought Japan, as we would say, kind of colloquially in the U.S. military, into the fight. And they were flying their fighters alongside American fighters to contest airspace over the Taiwan Strait and over Taiwan. And they were using their maritime self-defense force, the maritime self-defense force and air defense force, to attack and eliminate the People's Liberation Army Navy at sea. So that was the role that they thought that scenario, of course, there's a caveat, that scenario would drive them to do. Resupplying Taiwan I actually think this is one of the biggest questions. You can very quickly make an evaluation of, if the Chinese Navy puts this many forces in this area, how much risk is the other countries willing to take to bring supplies in, and how much is the fighting force going to be, any military situation like that is based on percentages and gut instincts and history, and a lot of unknowns. So that's tough, but it's doable. I think it's the political questions that are the bigger ones, right? So when people say, how hard is resupplying Taiwan? Well, is China willing to kill civilian mariners from around the world and sink civilian ships to make the statement that they're not allowed in? That's an important question. That's a very political question. That's a question that would make it very much difficult for China to win the war of global opinion. Now, maybe that's what they're willing to do. If they're not willing to do that, then it doesn't become that hard at all. You just sail past them. Right now, if they're being defended, are you talking about, if China is conducting unrestricted warfare against commercial shipping, then what are you talking about supplying? Are you talking about bringing in all the food and petroleum, et cetera, that Taiwan gets now? No, you're not going to be able to do that, right? But can you use smaller vessels, quicker vessels, stealthier vessels to bring in the specifically needed war munitions? That's probably not too hard, right? It's a difficult question to answer because there's so many variables, but hopefully I got at sort of the big picture of it.
So there's a lot of focus on Taiwan, and part of it, and we have questions to this, is, has the U.S. become less reliable? I don't want to call us unreliable, but has the United States become less reliable, or maybe less, clear? And we had retired Admiral Thomas on the Zoom saying, well, 20 years ago we could have easily told everybody to leave Taiwan alone, and we would sail in, and everybody's kind of back out of the pool. But now that's no longer possible because China has greatly increased its strength, and Japan has greatly increased it. So one question I have is, like, how does all of this, all of Japan's activity in Southeast Asia fit into this? So you mentioned the Philippines, you've talked about Vietnam, you've talked about Thailand, you are in Indonesia. What is Japan doing in Southeast Asia that we should be looking at and maybe are not looking at enough because we're so concerned over Taiwan?
Well, I think Japan is doing a great job of building friendships and proving itself to be a reliable partner. If you look at all the polling data, and there's a few that compare Southeast Asians' opinions of the trustworthiness and the helpfulness of different external powers, Japan always comes in clearly as number one by a long shot, right? And then as far as like who's trustworthy and nice, if I could just very simply put it, not academically, Europeans usually come in second, but there's a lot of skepticism about their capacity. And then the US comes in sort of third. But here's the difference, the biggest difference between the United States and Japan. Japan has done a lot of its work very quietly. I think that's not true in the 60s and 70s, when they kind of had the same reputation as China's Belt and Road Initiative today does. But they kind of felt burned by that, and they've been very careful. And if you go to Tokyo, people always complain like, "Oh, we don't get the credit for what we're doing." Well, I mean, that's sort of the major complaining, or that's the lieutenant colonel complaining. But in fact, that's part of the strategy, right? Part of the strategy is to be quiet, stay out of the news, do your building, have people slowly recognize you. Don't have a giant, here in Jakarta, some of the infrastructure is built. Put a plaque there so people walk by the plaque every day and notice Japan, but don't necessarily make a huge hoo-ha out of it. And that's a slow strategy, and and to some extent, it's not necessarily a strategy that Japan entirely chose. It was also partially chosen for it, so I don't want to give too much credit, but it's very, very effective. That's why they're the trusted partner. And the United States kind of does the exact opposite. We show up and everything has to be a splash, and everything has to be a presidential or secretary's deliverable, and it's gotta have a domestic and an international play, and it's got to be seen as big. And then you've set this expectation of this huge thing, and then the United States doesn't always completely follow through. Maybe the politicians change, maybe a better idea comes up, maybe the money for that runs out, or maybe in many cases we do exactly what we said we were going to do, but the United States just made such a big deal out of it, it's almost impossible to fulfill the expectations which have been set. So I think that we should be watching that. I think that we should be playing to that strength. I'm actually not, even though I'm fine with what the SDF is doing in Southeast Asia. I have no objections to it. And in fact, I think they can do more. But one thing that I observe is that the United States and Japan have comparative advantages in the region. And every time you send a Japanese aircraft to Southeast Asia, it's taking a Japanese aircraft out of the East China Sea. And the United States is flying to the East China Sea. So what have you gained? You haven't gained a net amount of air patrol, because the United States could have sent an aircraft that's currently in the East China Sea to the South China Sea. And when you convince a European partner or an Australian partner to bring a new asset there, you've done two things. One, you've increased the alliance capacity in the region, and you've demonstrated a new partner is interested and involved. So there's two gains there. Well, Japan's already shown it's interested, engaged, and it already has finite capacity. So from a comparative advantage perspective, you haven't gained much, but what you lose is, it's a slow erosion, and Japan has a long way to fall. But every time it does an action like that, it looks more like the United States, and it erodes that sort of high level of trust and that sort of confidence that they're a less military sort of power. And so again, there's no single event that I'd say don't do that. And I'm totally comfortable with Japan doing more, but I think we need to recognize comparative strengths. And I'm very happy for Japan to remain the courteous power, as one group of academics called it, the stealth power, as another one called it, or the ninja diplomats, as another called it. I'm happy for them to continue to play that role, because they do that much better than the United States.
Well, and I would footnote that, and they do that in business. Completely underestimated how important Japan is for anchoring some technology aspects of global supply chains. And
I was just walking down the street here, and in a very unassuming small building was Tokyo Construction. Just some old sign, Tokyo Construction, and it's not some fancy building, but what are they building? It's something huge, right? They're not here building small things. It's at least giant shopping malls, if not major road construction, et cetera.
So I could go on forever. Unfortunately,
so could I.
And time is up. So there are a bunch of really interesting questions, including the one that I really wanted to ask you, but we can't, which is, what can we do to de-escalate? Maybe, John, I can bring you back sometime, because this was really fascinating. I learned a ton. You have kept the audience at the edges of their seats. So thank you very much for getting up early to join us today. And audience, in 2 weeks from now, we're going to talk with somebody who has not only run the coast of for 3,000 kilometers during cherry blossom or something. He's sailing around the Japanese islands and is meeting people. So join us in 2 weeks from now for some tales from the distant coastlines. So thank you, John Bradford, for joining us today. Thank you, audience, for being here. And please, everybody, stay safe. And yes, let's figure out how to de-escalate. So thank you very much. Goodbye.
Bye.